Hello everybody, welcome back to AWS DevHour Building Modern Applications. My name is Ben Newton, I'm a Delivery Readiness Technical Lead based in Melbourne, Australia from AWS Training and Certification. This show is brought to you by AWS Training and Certification, and over the course of 8 weeks we're building a full stack application together, just jumping in and going through some theory components as we build out and just get our hands on keyboard and actually have some fun building an application. I'm joined here today as well by my friend May. Hey May, how you doing today?
Hello. Good. How is everyone doing? Welcome to the show of episode 4. So Ben, this week we are all talking about security in our serverless applications, aren't we?
We're talking about security, and if security is one of those topics where security is everyone's job, right? And so it's really important as a developer to really understand this section, and it's an important part of our journey with AWS DevHour, because this is also the week that we're starting to transition across to the front end component of our application. So we're going to build out the authentication component of our backend and go and start integrating our front end application as part of this as well.
So in the last 3 weeks, we built out the application, the backend applications. If you haven't seen the show, please go and check it out, our last episodes and all the series that we've built in the last 4 weeks. And this week, we are going to talk about Amazon Cognito and AWS Identity Access Management. So before we dive in, so I just want to do a quick round of, a reminder. If anyone's on the platforms, if you have any questions, feel free to type in the chat. We have awesome moderator on the chat ready to answer your questions. And you can use some commands on the Twitch platform that Ben built up. So we can use some command. So John just used the Vegemite command. Let's in touch with us. If you have any questions, feel free to use the chat platform. And as a reminder, so if you want to receive the weekly emails that we send it out with resources and links, you can register at the landing page.
I'm a happy little Vegemite.
There's no Vegemite this week, though.
Luckily.
Luckily, there is no Vegemite.
Awesome. So where is everyone coming from today? Based in the chat there. Where is everyone this week?
Yeah, where is everyone?
I assume you haven't moved from last week, but where are you all coming from? UK. Yeah. Super cold Virginia. Yeah.
New Zealand.
That's awesome. Atlanta. New York City, Singapore, Boston.
Canada.
Fantastic.
We're from Australia.
Awesome locations in there. That's super cool. India, Seattle, New Zealand, LA.
Amazing. So all these people from all around the world.
Yeah, that's super cool. Mexico. Awesome.
Going.
Yeah, super cool. And the other thing is as well, we wanted to just throw another poll into the mix here as well, just to get some insight from everybody on how did you hear about AWS DevHour? So be great. You can just pop in the number that corresponds to your answer there. Just how you came across the show. It'd be great to know. Get your feedback on that one.
Yeah. So because we've been running for 4 weeks, 3 weeks now. This is our 4th week.
This is our 4th week, or 3 weeks if it's like an array index or something. Let's not go there. Zero numbering.
From 0 to
We're okay with that.
And it'd be interesting to see how people heard about the DevHour from AWS blogs or from the LinkedIn posts from Ben and me, or through the friends.
Yeah. Awesome. So there's a really cool. There's a mix in there, so that's cool to know. Yeah.
That is awesome. Keep the polls, votes coming in. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great to know where you heard about it. And if there is something else, that I noticed that there's a percentage there of people that heard about it through other means. Just feel free to type in where you heard about it in the chat as well. Doesn't just have to be a number. If it's something outside of those as well, great to know about that.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. So, May,
Oh,
should we switch over to start just getting stuck in? It's going to be a really fun show this time, and we've got a lot of ground to cover as well, right?
we do.
So we might as well go on.
Because security is such a big topic, and there are a lot of things that we want to cover. But within an hour, we're trying to condense as much as we can and try to give you some nuggets during the show.
Absolutely. So let's go jump in, May. So let's have a quick look what we're going to be talking about for the most part today. And we're going to just talk through some of the theory components around this before we jump in. And then we're just going to kind of jump back into this. We're just going to get coding, and then we're going to come back and make sure that we're just familiar with what it is that we're doing. So during this show, we're going to be talking about two really important services within AWS. So the first one is, of course, AWS Identity and Access Management. And if you've worked with AWS before, you'll know that this is the core service within AWS that provides, authentication or authorization for AWS resources within your account. And it's a really important service. So as a developer, one of the things is that we're going to need to allow things to talk to our AWS resources, right?
Yeah.
Whether that be people or other services or our code, we need to be able to provide that access.
Exactly. And I guess this is the first point of, when you start using AWS, this is where you get started using the AWS IAM, where you start creating the users to allow within your team to allow people to start using the AWS resources. And that's where you start learning into, the security and the identity, which permission you give within the organization. So should we dig into the Amazon Cognito and AWS IAM?
Yeah, so Amazon Cognito. Let's go and flip over to the next slide there, man.
Yeah, so let's look at
talk a little bit about that and what it is going to do for us.
Before that, I just quickly recap week 3.
Okay.
So recap of week 3. First one is the episode 3. If you haven't seen it, please go and check it out. It's really cool. Amazon API Gateway integration with our backend application of Lambda. So that is our week 3. We go through API Gateway with the CDK and then the Lambda integrations. So that was last week.
That was last week. And if you haven't seen it, if you are new for the first time this episode, feel free to go and check it out. You can type in !episodes into the chat and it will give you the link. So feel free to do that. If someone might have also pasted in there, I think, as well. John, thank you. All right. So, May, please continue.
Cool. Week 4.
Vincent, is that a typographical error?
Is it? Unless... we will find out.
All right.
Okay, so week 4 is the coordinator. So we introduce some security into the application.
Yes,
so we have the API gateway, and we have Amazon S3 as a website. We'll get to that in this week, a bit on the S3 part, and then the next week is for the S3 episode alone. So we have the API gateway interacting with the user. We want to introduce some security to secure our website, to secure our API gateway, to make sure only the authorized users are allowed to access our applications. Isn't that cool?
That is cool. So absolutely, we want to lock this down, right? We don't at the moment. It's open. We don't like open. We like least privilege. So we're going to go and lock this down this episode. Yeah.
And in terms of like a user, it is very common practice, when you write the applications or like mobile application or web applications, you have a sign-in process to register your user, the sign up, sign in, forget password, that kind of authentication flow. And that's what we're going to build with Cognito today. So let's have a look at what Amazon Cognito is and to understand a little bit more about it. So Amazon Cognito is all that you can think of: authentication, authorization, user management for your application. So it can be mobile or web app.
Mobile or web app, and that's really where it shines, just as a differentiator. So identity and access management is all about controlling access to your AWS resources. Amazon Cognito is all about that customer-facing authentication. Right? So that's the important one. So
So yeah, it's have two type of pools in the coordinators that we want to differentiate. So one is on the left-hand side, you can see Amazon Coordinator Identity Pools. So let's dive into what is identity pools. So identity pools, it gives you a temporary credential to access AWS services like DynamoDB or other AWS services, the backend services, or things that's sitting in your AWS account. You can kind of see it like Ben like to put it that way, is a vending machine for the token vending machine that gave access to your user.
Yeah, and so what's important, right, is that, and we're going to talk about this in a second. So if you think about identity pools as being a vending machine for AWS credentials, and why are we using this with our application is because our application workflow sees us integrating with Amazon API Gateway for our actual API component. But from an application, we're also integrating directly with our Amazon S3 bucket, right? So we're uploading images or photographs into that bucket directly, and S3 is secure. So it's not going to just accept uploads from anybody. It needs credentials from AWS. So identity pools, it allows us to essentially provide an authorized token and get back credentials that allows us to talk to that API so that we can perform those S3 actions, if that makes sense.
And we will show that how we use the those two types of pools in the application. So so stick around.
Yes.
So we have in the identity pool, we have other features like authenticator or an authenticated user, kind of like feature where you want to allow a guest user access to some sort of resources and, or register user to a limited resources, that kind of thing. So you can define those features in the identity pool. Another thing I will highlight is the consistent identity. So with the identity pool, you can create a unique identity for each user in your coordinator. So that will allow you to create the IAM user, mapping the roles and things like that. So the whole features of IAM that you can map it with these identity user. But there are other things that you can do here. So if we look at it here, within these identity pools and user pools, you can federate it through third-party identity providers. If you can see like other social provider or a standard tokens to, authorize and authenticate your user.
Yeah.
And
so just to kind of re-clarify that, so whichever IDPs you're actually using, so if you have user accounts that are located elsewhere, the idea of identity pools is that it is that vending machine. We can provide it a token and it's going to give us AWS credentials back so that we can talk to AWS services. So you can do this if you have credentials out there on Google, Facebook, Amazon, Twitter, for example. Like we can use those already existing users if we want to, and federate those users so we can allow access to our from application AWS resources, right? Okay. May, you still there? I think May have frozen. Okay. All right. So I think May, are you back? Okay, we lost you there for a second.
Yeah,
it's good that you're back. Okay, so do you want to flip across to the next one, please?
Yeah.
On that one?
So
So
sorry,
user
my
pools.
connection dropped.
That's okay. Vegemite clogging the interwebs again. That's not the ideal scenario. But you can think of user pools or Cognito user pools as a purpose-built directory. So if you're building an application yourself, you don't want to necessarily have to go and create all of the user authentication components to manage passwords and multi-factor authentication and things. And scaling that is challenging, right? It's not an easy thing to do. And so user pools is your own IDP. It's essentially a directory that you can use, a user directory that you can use for your application to manage all of those components for you as a service, so that you can rely on AWS to scale that for you, and focus on your business logic in your application that's important to providing the value to customers, and leave the security components to Cognito, right?
Yeah, so because the user pool already included some of the built-in, if you can see on the screen, like built-in UI for applications, built-in user directory, that make it really easy to build out the application and integrate with your apps. So that's what we're doing today. Is like we don't really have to worry about creating the sign in process, because the user pool take care of all these authentication flow and authorization. All we have to do is integrate with the user pool, create a user pool, integrate with that, and Cognito will do the heavy lifting for us.
Exactly, and there's a lot of cool value adds as well. So it supports things like SAML, OpenAuth 2, OpenID Connect.
Yeah.
But there's also a whole lot of kind of advanced features that you can use with Amazon Cognito as well, which includes things like adaptive authentication.
Exactly.
There's a compromised password DB so that we can validate your users.
We can check for those. The compromised credentials.
How many people pop in the chat if you've ever used the same password across multiple services? Don't be shy, because I think a lot of people have in the past, and that is a dangerous place to be, because often what happens, of course, is a service somewhere gets compromised, somebody gets access to your password, and they go and try that in all the different platforms around the place to see how many accounts they can compromise. So we can check against an existing kind of database there to see whether you've got users that are using potentially a compromised account, right? So to try and help avoid that type of thing. As well as things like multi-factor authentication, right? To do that.
Really important to have an MFA on the account as well. Like not just on the user pools, like on your IAM user, having the MFA turned on is for another step of the security to lock down your account. Yeah.
Cool. All right. So do you want to flip across to the next one there, May? All right, cool. So what we're trying to do then really is we want you to walk away with this high-level piece of logic. If you can walk away with something from this section, is with Amazon Cognito, there are the two sides, right? The first side is the identity pool side, and you can think of that as literally a token vending machine for AWS credentials. So if you need your application to talk directly to an AWS service, then you can vend credentials for your application using this. We are using that within our application so that we can talk directly from our application to our S3 bucket, and that is a weird looking S3 bucket, but directly to S3, all right, so we can upload our objects.
Exactly, yeah.
From a user pool side, that's the directory of users, so we can have all of our users sign up and we create our own directory. It uses essentially... once we have a Cognito user pool token, we've had an authenticated user, we can provide that token to identity pools and get credentials out that we can then use to talk to Amazon S3. All right, so our application can use that. So that's how it fits into the scheme of things. Hopefully that makes sense. All right.
Yeah, it is quite the topic around the Cognito user pool and identity pool to get a head around. It takes a bit of time, but we're trying to explain that. But if you have any questions, feel free to pop it in the chat.
Absolutely.
Cool. So
all right, May, next one.
Diagram.
Please.
For
all right.
Today's application. So the client is our applications. And that's what we're going to build today. We're going to create the Cognito user pool. And as you can see here, the blue lines is going to the Amazon Cognito user pool to authenticate, giving username and password or any kind of authentication. From there, the Cognito user will give you back the CUP token back to the client.
Yep, the Cognito user pool token. So that is the token that we can use to authenticate. Now, if you want to flip across to the next set there, May.
Yeah.
So, of course, once we have our token, Amazon API Gateway is integrated with Cognito user pool. So we can have a Cognito user pool authorizer and have Amazon API Gateway take that as an authentication method. So we don't actually need identity pools at all if we're just talking to API Gateway directly. So with this flow, it's quite simple, and it allows us to lock down our API so that only authenticated users can talk to it. Right.
Exactly. So we know this is the user from the user pool, and it's authenticated, and then they can hit the API gateway to make a request. So should we look at the code and start building?
Yeah, great idea. All right, so let's go ahead and flip over to the code. So what we're going to start with is the backend code that we worked with from last week, and we're going to go and implement the authentication components as part of this. So the first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to go ahead and install a package So the package for this is the AWS CDK AWS Cognito package. We're going to need that to be able to build the Cognito components for our application. Once we've installed that package, the next thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to go through and add a few more imports into the mix. So the imports this side are essentially, and I'm going to get rid of this line here. A couple more imports. So we're going to import the Cognito, obviously. And as we go through, we're going to also need a few more imports as well. So from the API gateway, we're going to need to have authorization type because we're going to obviously integrate this with Amazon API gateway so that we can control access through our APIs. So we're going to add that into the mix as well as part of this process. All right, now that we've done that, we can go and start basically adding our Cognito constructs in to the mix. So we're going to start here. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go through and add our user pool. So that is the directory that we were talking about before. I'm going to use a snippet for this so that we can now go through the code. So essentially what we're doing here is pretty straightforward. All right, so we're using that Cognito package that we just added, and we're using the user pool class here, and we're just creating a user pool where, again, we're not going to go through the whole CDK component again, but we're using this the scope, this stack scope, and we're going to call this user pool. And there's a couple of properties that we need to provide here as well, or that we are providing here. The first one is self sign up enabled. We want people to be able to sign up to our application themselves so they can go in and register. That's part of the functionality of our application. So we want that to be the case. We're also adding auto verify into the mix so that the registered user can then go and validate their own email or their own account via email. So what this will do is Cognito will go ahead and once it gets a new registration, it will send a registration code or a validation code to that user's email address so that they can then validate their account, verifying their identity, right? And just as a bit of a tidbit of information in case you weren't aware, Cognito is actually Latin for known or aware, right? It's a kind
interesting.
of that's
I didn't know that.
yeah, it's giving someone an identity, right? It's all about having an identity within your system, and so that's an important property. And also sign-in aliases. So in this case, we're allowing people to use a username or their email address as their sign-in alias or the way that they can sign into the system there. So that is the first thing that we're going to add into the mix. And that user pool is important because that user pool is what we're going to use to, when we're obviously registering, it's going to allow us to have our directory of users that we can have to authenticate against our application, right?
Yeah. So this is all we need to create a user pool through CDK. And once we deploy that, that will create the user pool in the Cognito, and it's ready to start using like register and things like that in our front end application.
Yeah, exactly. So the next thing to do is we also need to add a user pool client or an application client. Now, we haven't spoken about this bit, but what an app client does is essentially allows us to perform the unauthenticated requests with Cognito that we need. So think about times where your user they've forgotten their password. I mean, how many people, pop in the chat, if you've forgotten your password before? Like, lots of people, obviously all the time, forget their passwords. That API call for Cognito, if you've forgotten your password, is unauthenticated, but we need to have a client that allows our application to make those calls. So this client is an important part of the application so that we can register and sign up and forget our password and retrieve it if we need to. There's also a secret that you can have as part of this as well, generate secret. That's more predominant if you're using a mobile application. You can enable this if you want to. We aren't in this case because we don't need to for browsers, but if you're using a mobile application, definitely feel free to go and do that. All right, so that's the client. We need to be able to make those requests so that we can authenticate and register and sign up and all of those sorts of things. All right. The next one is the identity pool, May. All right, so Let's flip back to your stick for a second. All right. If you could just maybe take us to the flow again of the.
Yeah, definitely. So we are going back to the identity pool, the whole diagram here.
Sorry, no, the other. Sorry, next. Have we got the other diagram? The with the actual flow.
That is the next one. It was coming up, Ben.
Okay. All right. Cool. Okay.
I was going to explain why we're using identity pool here.
Okay, good. All right, cool.
Bear with me for one second.
I'm with you. We're in sync.
So Ben's built out the coordinator for the authentications. Now we need an identity pool to access some of the resources like Amazon S3. And here to be able to go and interact with S3, we want to give some permission to the user. And we want to do it, the user like that from the coordinator with the identity pool to be able to, upload the image or access the website, which we're going to build in the next week. So using the identity pool here to, uploading the image, thanks for the drawing, using the identity pool, allowing the permission to the user. So let's look at the diagram, how it all works. So if you remember in the previous slide, we have the cup, the coordinator user pool token.
The cup.
The cup. And that token is going to use to access the coordinator identity pool. From there, we're going to exchange token. So we give the token to the identity pool. It's going to give it back, exchange the token, and recognize it's an authenticated user, give the temporary AWS credential. So the user who is requesting this access can now go on and interact with Amazon S3. So in this case, Amazon S3, to be able to access that, we have to give some permissions like either allow or deny this user based on the token and the credential that is provided. And then we will dive into AWS Identity and Access Management. Absolutely,
yeah. So
what is AWS Identity and Access Management? Is anyone familiar with AWS Identity and Access Management? IAM in the chat? Yes, no? So in the IAM, so we want to use the IAM to control access to our resources. Like it's not just on the S3, it's like all other AWS resources. This is the first point of place, the service where you are going to set permissions on your user. So in the IAM, we have a few definitions that we want to go over. So if you can see, we have the IAM user. So IAM user is basically identity or entity that you create within the AWS account. So with you have an AWS account, you create the IAM user. And then from there, you have groups. So group is quite self-explanatory. Groups of user, basically a way of grouping your user with the same permission that you want to grant rather than individually allowing the user and setting the permission. You can group those user and assign permission on those user. Then we have roles. The roles is also an identity that you create in your account that you can do the permission settings and stuff. But instead of uniquely you associated with one person or one user, a role is intended to be assumed by anyone who needs it. So by that, I mean a role, it doesn't have to be like a password or access key, but you can have a role, attach IAM policy to the role, and then you have the permission to that role. And what's going to happen is you have a user groups or AWS service is going to assume that roles. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And
so you have. Go on.
Sorry, I was going to say So they're the main. They're the three principles, and that's the authentication. The authn component of it is here. Underneath that, we've got the authorization component, right, Maeve, which is really where the policies come into play, right? So think of the policies as the authorization. It's the one that says what you can do. So the first one's who are you? And then the policies define what is it that you can do within
what
AWS.
You can't do on the AWS. You're not
what
allowed.
You can't do.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So that's how it decides whether you can upload an image into your Amazon S3 bucket. Can you call this AWS Lambda function? Can you put items into your DynamoDB table? That is all controlled via an IAM policy.
Exactly.
That says exactly whether you have access or not. Yeah. Everything is locked down from the start, so you have access to nothing, and you have to open up that access using least privilege as you need it. And that is an important thing as a developer, to always think about making sure you use least privilege. Think about exactly what operations somebody needs to make, and open up only that for only that particular entity, right, mate?
Exactly. That's it's the best practices in general to give least privilege to all the resources that you have.
Yes, absolutely.
So we talk about roles. So in the roles, like we said, it could be a user, it could be AWS service that you want to grant this role, or to access, in our case, to access the S3 bucket.
Yeah, so this could be a resource like a Lambda function so it can access the AWS bucket, the Amazon S3 bucket, and it can be a user, right? A user wants to access the images as well. Same thing, right? Can also, yes. All right.
So it is time halfway through the show, as you all know. Halfway through the show, we always do the challenge.
Absolutely.
So who is up for a challenge? Anyone's on the chat? We have a really
challenge
cool
time.
challenge time.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to point out what this challenge is, if you are new to the show, we have a very geeky setup here, a very nerdy setup, which essentially has a Raspberry Pi with a GPIO connector, and we've got a buzzer connected to it that makes a really horrible screeching noise that John loves. So, the longer we can play that buzzing noise for, the better. And we've also got a little cloud that we can turn on as well in the background there. So that's all API driven. So the idea is that the Buzz Pi API challenge, if you provide the correct answer into chat, what happens is it triggers that API, turns off that horrible screeching noise, and then we can leave it on for as long as possible so that John goes insane.
No. Please, no buzzer.
It hurts me more than it hurts you, John. It's really loud on this end.
We just enjoy it.
just to let you know. So absolutely. So what we're going to do in a second is we're going to throw up the question. It's going to be an interesting one this time around because it's fairly open-ended, right, May?
It is open-ended, so feel free to go crazy with the answers, and anyone who can guess the answer is going to create a really noisy buzz.
Absolutely. All right, we ready?
Ready?
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Okay. The answer this week is open-ended. It is one of the world's weakest, most commonly used passwords. We're using a user directory here, so just start brute forcing in the chat. Start typing in your really horrible passwords that...
Congratulations at KD10_. You are the winner.
Nice. KD10_. You got it. Awesome work. All right. So those passwords, yes, it was, in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. People research this when things are compromised around the world. Sometimes people look into what these passwords are that people are using, and it becomes really interesting. So congratulations, that was really quick. Nice work. Yeah.
Most common password, consistently for years.
Yeah, absolutely. For the last 6 years, you'd think people had cottoned on that that's probably not a great idea to have that as a password, but
it's a lot of
it is
ABC,
what it is.
1, 2, 3, and things like that. Password is the second common. I believe that was the second common password that people use more frequently. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. So. Awesomeness. All right, so let's get back to it then. So what we're going to do now is just go and continue this little build. So let's jump back into our code. So far, we've created our user pool. We've created our application clients, so that allows those unauthenticated requests to be made to Cognito. We've also created our vending machine for AWS credentials so that we can talk to our Amazon S3 buckets. We're now just going to continue adding some constructs in here because we also need to add a few other things to allow this to work. So the next one we're going to do is we're going to add a API authorizer there, right? So with this one, what we're doing is we're telling our API gateway that we want it to use an authorizer, and we're providing the authorization type. So this is where we're using that extra import from our API gateway package. So the idea is we're providing a number of different properties for this one. We've got the name, the basically the identity source. So we're going to be using a header, which is authorization, to identify whether or not it's an authorized request. The provider ARNs. So that's basically our user pool ARN. So the Amazon resource name that's provided for our user pool that we're creating. The REST API ID, so that we're going to be integrating it with, and then obviously the type that we're using. In this case, of course, it's Cognito from an authorization perspective, right, May?
Yeah.
Cool.
What's next?
So next on the list is the role. So what we're going to do is we're going to create that role. And if you remember from our diagram, that is the kind of hat-shaped little thing that we had Lambda wearing and we had the person wearing. That's not a really very good-looking hat, but the idea is that this is how we're going to provide access to the resources in the back end. And this is important because when you're using Amazon Cognito, when you authenticate against it, it actually uses roles to provide access to the resources in the back end. So when you get credentials from our identity pool, it's mapped back to a role that allows the access that we're going to provide it, right? So this is how it kind of works. So we've got multiple different personas within our front-end application. Like we might have privileged users that have paid a subscription fee, or administrators of our
it could be on
account.
Trial, like customers. So we want to give limited access to just for the trial customer. It could be a guest for the first timer. It could be a guest.
You know, may have guests. So that is
different roles and permission that we want to assign to our user.
Absolutely. So that is important. We're going to use that, and you can have multiple roles for different personas. We're only using the one role in this scenario, but that's okay. Once we have a role, so we basically, again, the role is part of the IAM package. And so we've got the role class, and we're giving it a number of different properties. So who it's going to be assumed by, and then we're providing the details for our identity pool. So our identity pool is going to be assuming this role, going, hey, user, here's your credentials to access S3 and upload your image into the bucket, and we're good to go, right?
Yeah.
But that role is kind of useless unless it has authorization to do these things, right? If by itself, hey, here's some credentials.
It has nothing. Like
go and
no
upload an image.
Or anything. Yeah.
Sorry, you can't. You're not allowed to do that. IAM is very strict, which is great because it's secure. But we need to provide something to allow this to be opened up. So we're going to add a policy to this. All right, and the policy, is an important aspect of it. And so an identity and access management policy is really that statement we're going through to provide what we can allow access to, right? So we've got the actions in this case that we're going to allow.
We can really granular on the permissions and the action that we want to assign on this one, right?
Very fine-grained.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Very fine-grained access control. And by default, it's default. It's, it denied by default, right? So what we're going to do is allow the actions to these resources, right? So we're going to allow people to get objects and put objects. So our application is going to be able to do those things. And also what we're going to allow access to. So in this case, you'll notice that there's some pretty interesting things going on with what we're allowing access to here. And what we're doing is we're using the Cognito identity as what we're going to allow access to. So in other words, once our user's logged in, they can only access their own things. So we're going to be using one Amazon S3 bucket, but a logged in user that has access to or signs up to our account, and they go ahead and they take a photo, and that's great, and they want to upload that into our bucket. They can only access their own because we make them known. Cognito is about being known. They get an identity, a really long identity string that says, you are this person, And we're only via this policy saying only this person can access their resources. Exactly. And that's a really important, aspect when we make, having these multi-tenant applications.
And we don't want other registered user to be able to access to some photos and something that uploaded into S3 buckets. So we want to lock it down only to give access to a particular user and their own folders in this case.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. And so what we're going to do now is we're also going to add another policy. So it's a very similar construct. This time around, it's a secondary policy to allow mostly our front-end application to kind of list objects in our bucket. All right, so that's where we've got the action list bucket. We want them to be able to list the objects that they have available to them. Mm-hmm. So we've got a condition there. So it has to be, again, based on their identity within AWS, within Amazon Cognito, but they can list the objects, and that's how we're going to work out, for example, what objects are available so that we can then, display the puppy on the website. Okay, which is important. Yeah. Display the cat picture, whatever it is we're going to put in our application. All right, so that's the second policy. The next thing we need to do is we need to create an attachment. So we need to basically attach our role to our identity pool. So we've kind of created these separately, but we need to now attach it so that we're attaching the role that we just created and we've added permissions to our identity pool. So when it vends credentials, we can use those credentials, right?
Exactly.
It links the two together.
Because otherwise it will be just a policy that we created with the permissioned, but it won't be doing anything unless we attach it to something else in the identity. So which is here we're attaching the policy into our role so the user can access to the S3 buckets within their own account and their own resources.
Exactly. So important step that we're going through. And again, a lot of these are because we want to talk directly to S3 to upload our images. If we're just using the API, I wouldn't need these components. We could just use the user pools. But we do want to talk directly to the AWS service. So that's what we are using in this component. Once we've attached the roles, the main thing we need to do is get some outputs. So
we want to see what we have created when we use the CDK and get it from output from the CloudFormation template, don't we?
Exactly. This says to CloudFormation, give us the outputs. We want these outputs. So we want to know what is our user pool ID, what is our app client ID, and what is our identity pool ID. Because guess what? We're going to need them in our front-end application. All right. So that is important to us. So I'm just going to save that, and there's two more things that we need to create as a part of this to make sure it works. So we need to tell API Gateway that it's authenticated requests only. So we need to lock that down. So we're just going to add a couple of authorization steps. We're going to add an authorization type, and in this case, it's Cognito authorization. And we're going to use the authorizer reference that we created before as well. So we need to do this for both of our methods for
That's
API
right,
Gateway.
Because otherwise it will be just an authenticator's API Gateway and anyone can access it. But now it's only the Cognito user can access the API Gateway requests.
Absolutely. Now I think
deploy.
My terminal's a bit small, but let's go and do it.
Maybe time for a visual recap.
Oh.
Visual recap. Yeah, good idea.
That is a good idea. Do you want to switch back to...
Yes, I will switch back. Let me just kick off a deploy, and as that's deploying, you can see that it's going to go through and create all of our resources that we just created, the user pool and everything like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a CDK deploy and let that go and actually build these resources in my account. While that's going, let's go back to your screen, May, so we can do a visual recap. All right.
Visual recap. Whoever remind that, thanks for the reminder. So we've been talking a lot about Cognito and the IAM user and stuff. So we have Amazon Cognito. What we just did was creating the Cognito user pool. And user pool is to allow the user to be able to sign up, to sign in and do the authentication and authorization. Also created identity pool, which is to be able to access the Amazon S3. So to get images, if you remember the get and put action that Ben created for the Amazon S3. Then
Yeah.
we also add the user pool for the API gateway. So now API gateway has the authorizer. It's authorized only the user that is registered from the Amazon coordinator to be able to make a request to the API gateway. So that's what we just built, API gateway authorizer, created the Amazon coordinator user pool and identity pool CDK with the CDK, and identity pool to allow the Amazon S3 to get and put images.
Absolutely.
Then what else do we create? So we create those three things, and we just deployed it in the CDK. Using, we created a policy. So in the IAM, if you remember, I would just quickly switch on to the slide of the IAM. So from the client to be able to access the S3, we created the IAM, attached the policy. So with user, we have user grouped and roles, created a roles for the Lambda, and
Yeah.
the Lambda allowed to execute and allow permissions and attach the IAM policy to that Lambda.
So this role, if you remember, so what this is attached to, we created the attachment to the identity pool.
I just switched the visual.
And so I guess in this scenario, just so people don't get confused, we have got a role for Lambda in our application, but the role we just created was for our identity pool. And the identity pool is going to use that role when it sends out credentials or vends credentials to us so that we can talk to S3 directly from our application. It's in the persona of that role, right? So it adds that role so our user can have access to the
Definitely.
bucket. All right. So let's go and have a look to see where my terminal is at. The deployment is at.
I hope that gave a bit of a high-level overview on that.
Yeah. So that's really good. So now what we have is we have our backend resources. So you can see here we've got the outputs from our stack, from our CloudFormation stack, and it's provided us with those resources. So what we're now going to do is we're going to flip over and we're going to go and configure our front-end application. So if we could just get the repo details popped back into the chat, you can just type in !repo. There's a front-end repo available now, and the front-end repo is going to allow you to go ahead and follow along and take a look at this. So we're just going to go and have a look at that to see what it looks like. So if we go and have a look at our front-end application this time around and open that up in our editor, what we're going to do is we're going to go and configure this. Now, this is a React application. If you're not familiar with React, React is basically a JavaScript library, and it allows us to build front-end applications quite nicely. It was developed by Facebook quite a while ago. And it basically allows us to build components, and it's sort of it's a nice way of building our, I guess, front-end application, or a nice way of building our front-end applications. So one of the things we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about this. I'm not going to dive into too much React because, to be honest, we don't have the time, and that's not the focus of this. What is the focus of this, though, is the library that we're using for our React application. And the library that we're using is Amplify. All right. So we have this really great service, or this great kind of framework with AWS called AWS Amplify, and it includes a whole lot of things. I don't know, May, if you wanted to switch over briefly to here.
Exactly.
So go for it, May.
Sorry to cut you off. Just briefly go over the a couple of ways that you can integrate Coordinator into the application. So one is AWS Amplify. We'll go through all of this. So let's look at what's Amplify and what it does for the application. So the Amplify is a comprehensive library. It's mainly built for the mobile and web applications, and really easy to build up your components on your applications. It's also a tool chain. So if you can see here, you can create serverless backends like DynamoDB or GraphQL. If you remember in the API Gateway episode, we talk about a little bit about GraphQL. So it has built-in, authentication, storage, and any other common use case that you would probably build with the application or your mobile app. And it has a lot of built-in components. It's really save time, and within a few lines of code in the CLI, you can build out your backend or mobile application, right?
Yeah, so whether you're building out like a GraphQL API and you're using DynamoDB in the backend, Amazon DynamoDB, and like your applications can be really easy to build out via Amplify. It kind of builds up the infrastructure as code for you as you're going along. It's just you kind of use the CLI and it kind of just builds it up.
That's right, and it has the UI components in there, so. You don't really, if you're not a front-end developers, or like if you don't want to spend much time on UI components, you can use those built-in components to really build out that. So my first Amplify application was the chat application. So it's like offline real-time chat application with Amplify using GraphQL and DynamoDB behind the scene. And Amplify with the CLI. If you haven't tried it out on the Amplify, and it's really easy to get started.
It is really cool. One thing I wanted to point out though is that we're not using all of Amplify for our application at the moment, because what we've done is defined everything in the AWS CDK. We wanted to build everything in the CDK, so that's what we've done. What we are using though with our React application is the library, and maybe if I can get one of the mods to just pop in the link to the Amplify library in the chat there for you. But essentially, that's what we're using within the application to make it easier to talk to these services, because there's a lot of the functionalities available within that library.
Exactly.
So that's what we're doing. We are going through, and we've installed.
So we're using Amplify framework here.
Yes. So we've installed Amplify, and what we're doing is we're basically using the Amplify library to access these resources. Now, what we're in at the moment is the index file, so the entry point, and we're going through and configuring our Amplify so that we're providing it with the details. Now, there's lots of different areas you can have here. You've got auth, you've got storage, for example, you've got the API component, you've got all of the different areas you can configure here. We're going to build on that next week, because we're going to add all of the API functionality and everything in next week to add that functionality. For the moment, we focused in on the auth, and we're providing a number of different props here for that. And we're pulling that from a file called config.json. And this is where we're popping those details. So as you likely remember, we've got outputs available to us. So we've got our app client's ID, for example, May.
Yep.
So if we go ahead,
so we're
going to go and copy the app client's ID into our details here. We're also going to go and grab our identity pool ID. So this is our token, or our AWS credential vending machine. So we can talk to our S3 bucket.
So this is quite handy to get the output. So you don't have to go into the console and get all these details. So you can just get it from the outputs of the CloudFormation template. Yeah,
exactly. And now we've got our user pool ID. So this is the user pool that we're going to be using. And of course, you're going to need your region. So in this case, I'm in Melbourne. So, so I'm looking forward to the Melbourne region to launch. But until then, it's going to be 2.
You're going to be
AP Southeast 2, going back up to May's territory. But that's okay. That's all good. So that basically adds the configuration for our application. Now, just to give a quick high-level overview of what we're doing here as well. If we go and have a look at our app file, you can see that we've got a number of different components that we've created for this to add things like change password, forgot password, register password, and we're handling things like our login, so sign in and sign out here. So we've got that kind of handled, so we can log in, log out You can see that we're using the auth that's provided as part of the Amplify library, the auth class, and we're signing out. So we're passing through a number of different props there to do that. And of course, we've got our routes down below here as well, so that we can go through and provide authenticated access. So you can see to go to the profile option, and we're going to extend on this next week, we need to be authenticated and we need to be verified as well. So if we're not verified, it's going to redirect us back to the appropriate link.
Yeah. So this is where we define the authentication flow, like sign up, sign in, logins, and all these things.
Exactly.
So should we test it out, the application?
Yeah, so let's do an npm start. So what that should do is fire up our little local web server here and allow us to actually go in and test this out. So let me just, I'm going to bring this up in the browser here, if I can. To see what this looks like. All right, so this is what our application looks like at the moment. So hey, we've got some front end action.
I haven't seen front end for a while. We've been working on the back end.
So what we're going to do is we're going to go through and register quickly a user. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and register here. So I'm just going to use a fake email address. It's actually a real email address, but it's a pro email address that I've got. And I'm going to go and give this a password.
I hope it's not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the password.
I totally hope you're correct. Right. So then it asks for validation. So that's going to send me an email. I've got that email verification now come through to that account, so I can go and copy that, and I'm going to go and validate my account by pasting in the that's not the one I wanted. Didn't copy. All right, so let's copy that and let's go and ahead and paste that in here. So this allows me to verify my account. Once it's verified, Cognito is going to say, hey, we're happy little campers and you are verified. And if I can go into user pools in here quickly, I should be able to go and have a look to see if we've got our user pool that we can leverage. So we've got users. You can see here I've got my user that I just created. It has been confirmed and verified. The email's been verified. And of course, now we can go and sign in with that user so that we can access it, right? So let's sign in here. All right. So actually, that's not signed in. Let me just